So looking specifically at the structure and parts of the heart. The heart itself is hollow on the inside. There's empty space. They call it cone-shaped. It's very muscular and it's located in your thoracic cavity. Size, average adult heart is 14 centimeters, 9 centimeters wide. That's pretty specific for an average. They say that the size of the person, typically your heart is going to be about the size of your fist. And the smaller the person you are, the smaller your fist, probably the smaller your heart. So that's kind of a way to estimate or guess how large your heart is. Heart lies in the mediastinum, under the sternum. The sternum is there to protect your heart. The apex, which is the pointy bottom part of the heart, extends to about the 5th intercostal space, and then the base lies pretty much underneath the 2nd rib. So your heart is protected very well. Your heart and lungs are under your sternum, under your ribs. They are vital organs and they are protected very, very well. So here you can see just a couple pictures of your lungs and heart, and then an actual heart. So coverings. The peri, remember peri means outside. Pericardium encloses the heart. It's also called the heart sac sometimes. It's the outside lining that your heart is going to be inside of. It is made up of 2 layers. There's an outer tough layer, and then it's surrounded by a more delicate thin layer. And the visceral pericardium is the inner delicate layer. And this is going to be directly right on the heart. So at Sanborn, we dissect hearts, and the heart organ has this visceral pericardium that attaches directly to the heart. At the base of the heart, the visceral pericardium becomes the parietal pericardium, and that's going to line the fibrous pericardium, so it's just looking at different parts to the pericardium. And we'll look at a diagram that shows this a little bit better. Between the parietal and visceral is a space called the pericardial cavity. And that is filled with the serous fluid that protects the heart, prevents friction, prevents things from rubbing. And this is also the area, if you hear of someone has fluid on the heart or fluid around the heart, this cavity is the cavity that fills with fluid. So there's an outer lining, there's a cavity, and then there's the lining that is directly on the heart itself. So here, this probably being a better picture. So I'm taking basically a little chunk out right here, and if I look at that, my fibrous pericardium is the outside tough layer. And then parietal is, if you remember from, I think it might have been the first chapter. Visceral lines the organ, parietal is on the outside, and then you have a cavity in between. So visceral on the organ, parietal outside of the cavity, and then this is where that serous fluid is to protect the heart and prevent friction and rubbing and such. The wall itself of the heart has 3 layers. Outer layer, now notice cardium. Cardio deals with heart. So the outermost layer, epicardium, is your connective tissue, epithelial tissue. It houses a lot of the blood that actually keeps your heart alive. Those are called coronary arteries, made up of the same material as the visceral pericardium. And then the middle layer, this is the thickest layer, this is the main layer. Myo means muscle. So myocardium is basically your heart muscle. It is the thick part that makes up the heart wall. By far the thickest. Then on the inside, we have an endocardium. It's very smooth. So if you ever have a chance to dissect a heart, the inside of it is very, very smooth. That's the endocardium. It is continuous or connects with the endothelium of other vessels. So, for example, my aorta is a big vessel that leaves the heart. That endocardium is going to also leave the heart and attach to the aorta. The endocardium also contains Purkinje fibers, and when we start talking about EKGs and your heart rate and stimulus from neurons, the Purkinje fibers are part of your conduction system that interact with your nervous system is what they do. So here, if I take out a larger chunk, starting on the inside, so here would be hollow space inside of your heart. Endocardium, very smooth lining. Myocardium is basically just the thick muscle of the heart. And then we go to the epicardium, which is the same as your visceral pericardium, so it's the lining on the outside. I have that cavity that's in the middle, pericardial cavity, and then I have my parietal pericardium and fibrous on the outside. The heart has 4 chambers. I kind of assume that you may know that already. There's 2 atria, or 2 atrium that sit at the top, and then there's 2 ventricles that sit at the bottom. So the atria, which is plural for atrium, they receive blood. So right atrium is going to receive blood from your body. Left atrium is going to receive blood from the lungs. So the top 2 portions of your heart receive blood. They have very thin walls. They're called auricles. If you look at a real heart, they're actually much smaller than they look like in diagrams. The thick muscled ventricles then are on the bottom, and they are the parts that force blood out. So right ventricle is going to force blood out to the lungs. Left ventricle is going to force blood out to my entire body. Septum divides the atrium and ventricle, so it divides the chambers. Each has an AV valve, atrioventricular, so it's the valve in between your atrium and ventricle. These are important to make sure that blood drops into the heart and doesn't come backwards. It prevents backflow of blood in your heart. People will have leaky valves sometimes. A heart murmur. A lot of times a heart murmur can be caused by issues with these valves. Right AV valve is called tricuspid. It has 3 cusps or parts to it. The left AV valve is called bicuspid. It has 2 flaps, or it's also called the mitral valve. And then these chordae tendineae are long, stringy muscles that hold those flaps from flapping through or pushing through to the other side. So these cords are attached to papillary muscles. These papillary muscles are basically just a place of attachment, and like I said, they prevent backflow so that oxygenated and deoxygenated blood don't mix. Vein-wise, the superior and inferior vena cava bring blood from the body to the right atrium. We'll look at diagrams. It'll make it much easier. The coronary sinus drains blood from the heart. So your heart itself is an organ. Blood flows through it, but your blood or your heart also needs blood. So there are some vessels on the heart that actually feed or drain the heart, and they typically have the word coronary with it. Right ventricle has a thinner wall than the left ventricle because it only has to pump blood to the lungs, where your left ventricle has to give a huge squeeze and pump blood to your big toe, to your brain, and everywhere. The pulmonary trunk, so at the bottom of the pulmonary trunk that leads to the lungs, is the pulmonary valve. They are also called semilunar valves, and they prevent a return of blood back into the ventricle. So every valve in your heart prevents blood from flowing backwards because we don't want that to happen. So left atrium, left side, blood comes back from the lungs through the pulmonary veins, goes through the left atrium, goes through the mitral valve, left ventricle pumps to the whole body, and that goes out through the aorta. The aortic valve is the valve that occurs there and prevents backflow of blood into the left ventricle. I'm reading through this fairly quickly because when we look at the diagram, this is good to go back and look at, but the diagram